So welcome. This is the launch of our new research, Let Charities Shine. We are joined today by some amazing speakers who we hope will provide a really good range of perspectives and experiences to provide some insights into why this matters. And one of the things that we're really including today is the voice of charities, because that's at the heart of the Open and Trusting initiative that this piece of research hangs underneath. Open and Trusting is a community of over 100 funders who are all trying to make their grant making processes more open, more trusting, and better attuned to the needs of those that they fund. And this research sits within that. It's about thinking about application and assessment processes and what those might look like if they were more open and more trusting. So we hope today is going to provide some stimulation for you to think about what it means for your practice. We know that there is no neat fit, that all funders are different, no one funder is the same. We understand that and we welcome that within the Open and Trusting initiative. We recognise that people are working to different accountabilities, different contexts, different scales of organisation, different organisational arrangements. And so we're kind of working with that diversity, but we're also aware that many of you worked on, as funders are working, worked on both sides of the funding dynamic, so to speak. So people have been grantees as well as grant makers now. So this is really about encouraging empathy and humanity in grant making. So just to introduce our speakers who you have on the screen, they'll be speaking in a moment, but just so you know who we're joined by, we have Keeva Rooney, who's a researcher at IVAR. We have Theo Richardson-Gool, who's the CEO at Public Health Pathways. We have Jamel Ismail, Director at the Association of Somali Voluntary Organisations. Hoare, Executive Director at the Blue Thread. Katy Beechey, Programme Director at Texel Foundation. And Laura Solomon at Fixiform. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Keeva Rooney, our researcher, who's going to bring a bit of the report to life for you, share some of the insights from Let Charities Shine, and then we'll move into our speakers. So I'm going to ask everybody except Keeva to turn your screen, your video off and mute yourself, please.
Thank you so much, Eliza. So like Eliza said, I'm just going to very, very briefly share some of the research that sits behind the report. This is where we see if the tech works. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see some of the findings I can share with you. Okay. Like Eliza said, this is part of the Open and Trusting initiative that we've been doing. And what we wanted to do was really to look very deeply into the applications and assessment process and how funders can make this much more open and trusting. So we actually started this research a little while ago. So in May of last year, we conducted a series of sessions with charities. So as part of our Open and Trusting work. These sessions focused on what applying and being assessed for funding felt like for charities. It was about like what was the emotional toll of doing this work. So in total, we spoke to 22 charities who said that while the work was really exciting and rewarding and creative, that dealing with that constant rejection could feel really difficult. So we actually have a word cloud of the words they use to describe what funding feels like. And you can see words like challenging, frustrating, repetitive, time-consuming. These words really do come out. So I think it really highlights what it actually feels like to apply for funding. So charities mentioned that there were 5 things that funders could do to help them. So the first was to continue the flexible, open and trusting funding practices that many had adopted during the pandemic. The second was to be more transparent with eligibility criteria and to share decision-making processes. The third was to consider different requirements depending on the size of grant. So for example, allowing video applications and using publicly held information. The fourth was to ring-fence funding to support specific groups or communities. So for example, smaller community-led groups, smaller charities that don't have that same resource that larger organizations have, maybe having a certain ring-fenced fund specifically for small charities, for example. And the fifth one was to create opportunities for open dialogue. So after this work, we really wanted to explore how a small group of funders are trying to bring about these principles within their application and assessment processes. So we reached out to 4 funders who have signed up to our Open and Trusting initiative. So these funders were the Blue Threads, CareTech Foundation, Texel Foundation, and the Joffrey Charitable Trust. And all of these funders intentionally approach applications and assessments in an open and trusting way. So their approach towards applications have now been written up into case studies and a report, which was published earlier this month. And this is published together with the insights from 6 charities that they fund, who agreed to share anonymized views of their experience as applicants. Okay. So what we learned across these funders can be split into 6 principles. So the first principle was don't waste time, be honest about priorities and prospects. And this is all about being open and transparent about the process. The second was to accept risk, challenge established assumptions about risk. And this really asks funders to look at risk in a different way. The third principle was to create a chance for charities to shine. So this is about creating an application process that allows charities to put their best foot forward. The fourth was to ask relevant questions, so to streamline application forms. So for example, this could include using publicly held information. The fifth was to pay attention to how the process feels for charities. And we really encourage funders to put yourself in charities' shoes and see what the process actually feels like. And that kind of harks back to the earlier research we were doing. And then the final principle is to encourage meaningful feedback and to act on this learning. So today our speakers will kind of bring a lot of these principles to life a little bit. So we're going to be hearing from funders and from charities around these principles, and just to hear a little bit about what this kind of actually looks like in the day-to-day. And that was everything I had. So I'm just going to stop sharing and hopefully you won't see my screen anymore.
Thanks very much, Keeva. That really did bring it to life. And now I will introduce our first speaker, which is Theo Richardson-Gool from Public Health Pathways, who's going to give a perspective from a charity on why it matters to really make these application processes and assessment processes as open and trusting as possible. Theo.
Thank you very much, Eliza, and thank you, Keeva, the IVAR team. I think congrats on producing such a wonderfully titled report, Let Charity Shine. We meet today, I guess, on an odd week when it comes to the experience of small charities, because after 14 years, yesterday was the final Small Charity Coalition event. And it's an important reminder is 80% of charities operate on budgets under £100,000 per year, where I think Keeva was mentioning resources are limited quite often. And I think these infrastructure organizations like IVAR are valuable because they represent vast memberships and have access to information to help build collective knowledge. And it's a privilege to speak on behalf of the charity sector, and great to be here with Jamal, Hannah, Katy, Laura on the release of these 6 principles for open and trusting application. What can I say about the report? It reads well, it's well put together, it's accessible, it does something I'm often quite bad at, it speaks in plain English, and most of all, it's practical. And speaking from the perspective of the charity, it feels genuine. The report expresses different sides also. And speaking from the charity perspective, I work for Public Health Pathways, which was established in April 2020 in response to the pandemic, because we were concerned that the root causes of inequalities, inequities, and distrust were being overlooked. So we focus on making public health education accessible, because health starts in the community, in the family, at home, in school. And we believe that innovation to make society healthier comes from within communities. And going further than that, speaking to someone at the World Health Organization suggested that we should use stronger language. We know that innovation to make society healthier comes from within communities. And I think this sentiment goes beyond public health. The charity sector is so often operating at a grassroots level, locally, and they are the innovators to support our communities. They have feet on the ground and they have access to the solutions that help make our communities healthier. So why I'm excited about the IVAR report is it is providing an understanding, and it's providing an understanding into the challenges that charities face. So focusing on two of the principles, if I may, ask relevant questions and create a chance for charities to shine. So before I elaborate there, I was recently reading a book titled Blind Spot. It's authored by a Harvard professor in global health, Salman Khashoggi, and he worked closely with the late Paul Farmer, who established Partners in Health. They describe how governments and large donors shape the direction of funding streams in the health sector. And I quote, "They codify practices through the projects they support," end quote. By defining the requirements for funding applications, they explain this transmits a particular outlook that manifests particular outcomes. Their concern with the codification of practice is, I quote, "It threatens to act as a great solvent, remaking fundamental values and reconfiguring social relations," end quote. So why raise this? I think perhaps the idea where funders codify practice resonates with those who work outside the health sector and indeed on the charity side of things. And looking at principle 4, ask relevant questions, streamline application forms. This is really important. The application is a key mechanism for funders, and charities do appreciate this and spend hours, if not several days, completing applications. And in addition to streamlining and asking relevant questions, perhaps we can think about how you ask the question, because a well-constructed question and clear question can transform the answers that you receive as well. And principle 3, create a chance for charities to shine. Maybe if we consider what we've discussed, or what I've discussed now, is we know that the vast majority of charities are small. We know that they have limited resources. We know they have access to communities. And we know the innovation to make society healthier comes from within communities. So perhaps we can conclude allowing charities the opportunity to shine also allows the opportunity for communities to shine. So thank you. Over to you, Eliza.
Thank you, Theo. That was brilliant and a really kind of great start to the webinar to hear from your perspective. And I think just a great reminder of the power of kind of grassroots community level solutions and approaches to needs in communities, and the requirement for funding that enables that rather than kind of dampens that innovation. I'm going to hand over to our next speaker now. I'll introduce Jamel Ismail, who's the director at the Association of Somali Voluntary Organisations. So Jamal, if you'd like to turn your screen on and come off mute, and Theo and I will mute ourselves and turn our screens off.
Yes, sure. Hi, thank you. And yes, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me today to this event. It's really a privilege to participate and be part of this report. And my name is Jamel Ismail. I am the director of ASFO. ASFO is Association of Somali Voluntary Organizations. We are based in Hammersmith and Fulham. And we created this organization at the end of 2019. And the reason we created this organization is it was to work together and for the Somali Voluntary Organization working in the Hammersmith and Fulham. We have a 10-member organization in our umbrella, and our aim was to reduce inequality and make our voice heard, and to use the resources better and avoid any duplication of services. And one of the challenges we have faced and during that last 3 years is that funding. And a lot of those small organizations, they struggle with funding. And there are so many small organizations which have direct contact with the residents and local communities. They were not able to continue because they didn't have enough resources. And I believe this research, it highlights a lot of issues, which we are, as an organization, have been experiencing. For example, we spend money, a lot of money to write funding applications. And most of these applications are rejected and without explanation. And we believe that, you know, there's no one to complain to, but you feel that you need someone to hear your voice, and you can tell your concerns, that, you know, small organization, they should be looked at carefully, and also the procedure of defending and the feedback should be more transparent. And I believe really this report is representing the voice of the charities, because it's communicating what we are experiencing to the funders, and this will encourage these funders to listen and, you know, open their mind about the experience of the small organization when it comes to the funding. And I believe that we funders need like to take the risk and support the small organizations, because most of the funding, they go to the large organization who has a good connections and the relationship with these organizations. They're doing a good job, that's fine. But also there should be a space for the small organizations, and the funders need to take that risk and support those organizations which have less reputation, and maybe they are new and they are established by the community to make a positive change. So that also needs to be you know, taken into account. So I believe that this report, it highlights an important message to the funders to look at their practice and try to get a proper feedback, so we can also learn, for example, and build that relationship and make it like a partners. Because at the end, as a voluntary organizations, we want to make a positive change to the community. And the funders as well, they want to support us to do that positive change. So in reality, we are partners. So we need that relationship that makes us feel as a partners. And the only way that can be done is that to be more transparent about the decision-making process and the feedback, you know, and to be part of all of that, and people have more trust, you know, like, and confidence on the procedure. So I will say, our congratulations to the IVAR organization and the Katy and Hannah and Keeva, Eliza, and all the team. They have done a great job. And I believe that we need to continue to raise the voice for the small charities. And I believe hopefully this report will improve that relationship between the small organizations and the funders. And we hope that the approach will be more flexible, and, you know, like there will be more clarity and more transparent, so that we are all, you know, have a confidence in the procedure, and hopefully to achieve what we all want. And I would like to thank everyone who participated and make this report possible today, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamal.
Thank you.
That was great to hear from Jamal there, and to really hear that perspective, echoed by Theo as well, of the importance of supporting particularly small charities, but the vital role that those kinds of charities play in terms of their connection to needs in communities and being best placed to respond. Particularly, we've seen that obviously in the last 18 months to 2 years. And the need for funders to think about what that means in terms of how they give feedback, giving a voice to charities, allowing charities who are applying to feel like they're being listened to and valued. And I think raising some important questions there about access as well for those who are maybe newer charities, or those who don't have smaller charities who perhaps have more competition around them than bigger charities with more resources. So we're going to invite two funders now to share their perspectives on what it's taken to make their processes more open and trusting, the application and assessment processes. So I'd like to introduce Hannah Hoare, who's the Executive Director at the Blue Thread. I'll hand over to you, Hannah. Thank you.
Thanks, Eliza. Hi, everyone, and thanks for bringing this together and for all the work that everybody does on changing the face of grant making. I think this is really important. So I lead the Blue Thread. We are a family foundation. We're based in London and fund mainly in the UK. Most of the organisations we support are small grassroots groups. And we tend to offer small unrestricted grants, which we know can be really valuable for organisations who often have pockets and gaps in their funding, either between applications or where project funding doesn't cover everything they want to do. We set up our, I guess, formal grant making process a couple of years ago here. And when we did that, we thought quite carefully about how we make a process which feels supportive and respectful to charities, and how we think about that. And I think so much of that is underpinned by, I guess, really acknowledging that we can't actually, as a funder, achieve our aims without the frontline organisations that we fund. And I think some of that sometimes gets lost in sort of application and grant making conversation. And so I guess for me, I brought quite a lot of experience applying for funding myself to the table, and really had some thoughts, I guess, about how we could create a process that was more supportive to those on the other side and would allow us to make grants in a way which I guess respected our partners as those that really do the proper work and the hard work on the front line, and our job is to enable them. So I think of the principles, which I think are really clear and valuable, I think for me the most important one is about how the process feels. I think so much of this can be achieved by thinking about what would it feel like to be the applicant or the charity or the partner on the other end of the process. Would they feel intimidated or exhausted by filling in a long form? Does the process that you're asking them to go for feel like a justified use of their time, a proportional use of their time? And what does it feel like if you say yes or no? And how do you go about doing that? So for me, I think that's the most important one. I think the other piece that can be really important is this piece about risk. I think often that as funders, we sort of default to whatever the most thorough application process looks like, because we presume that reduces our risk as funders. I think it's really important for us to think about what are the risks actually that we're trying to avoid? What are the risks that we as a foundation, or whoever you are able to tolerate? And therefore, how do you design your process accordingly? So if you're a small private funder like we are, you might be open to supporting perhaps newer kind of startup type organizations who might not have all of the bells and whistles and 3 years of accounts and things like that, but some of our colleagues and the bigger foundations are looking for. Equally, at a bigger foundation, you might be open to thinking about much bigger pots to spend and what do you need to be able to do that. So I think thinking about actually what is the size and the scale and the type of funding that you're giving out, and what information do you really actually genuinely need in order to make those decisions, I think is really important. I'm conscious of everyone's time and I'm sure people have lots of questions, so I'll pause there if that's okay, Eliza, and then Katy can jump in.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great to hear your perspective at the Blue Thread, and really just the kind of emphasis on really challenging yourself as a funder about what you need to ask and what you need to know, and that kind of caution about actually sometimes the aspirations that you might have and your funding processes can kind of get out of sync in terms of an overly zealous approach to application processes if you're trying to take off lots of risks or mitigate lots of risks, but actually kind of really challenging yourself to look at what we're really trying to do here and how can we strip back our process to align with that. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker in this panel, which is Katy Beechey, who's Programme Director at Texel Foundation. So Katy, if you'd like to turn on your screen and unmute, and I will disappear.
Thanks, Eliza. Just to say, really grateful for this opportunity, but also how we really value being part of the open and trusting community. And since we've joined, it's something that I talk about regularly, both with charity partners and other funders and on calls like this. So if anyone participating isn't already a member, I highly recommend that you sign up, because it's a really tangible kind of current movement that's definitely going in the right direction. It's a really supportive group. So I just wanted to sort of give you a little bit of a bit of support, basically, to say we found it really helpful being part of this community. In terms of our grant making process and application process at Texel Foundation, is something that we have been looking at and adapting and evolving for the last few years. So we're a corporate foundation, and we donate 10% of our net profits to charitable causes and social enterprises every year. And one of the things that we're always looking for in our partners is that they constantly evolve and adapt to meet the needs of their beneficiaries and the causes that they promote. But we also recognise that we need to do that as well. So something that we try to do every year before we open the grant application process is to look at it and say, right, is this applicable still? Is this meeting the needs of our partners? Are we asking the right questions? So what we did a few years ago was to send out a very brief anonymous survey asking some of those questions of our existing partners, and we sort of used their feedback to tweak our application form, really streamlined it. And then I approached a couple of our very experienced existing partners and asked them to look over our redrafted version and get their thoughts, and they did. And there, as I think Laura will allude to later, there are some very key, very emotive points that come up that a lot of organisations feel very strongly about, that they find very restrictive in a lot of application forms. So we were very keen to remove those if they were there. And then every year we've gone through this process, and every year we've changed our form, and it's sort of been streamlined right down to this year. It was just 3 questions, which were, where are you at as an organisation? Where would you like to be in the next 12 months? And how can we help you get there? And the idea was, I think, speaking to Theo's point on wording, we wanted to enable the opportunity for our charity partners to put everything into their own words, not be restricted by the questions that we posed. And then we also asked them to share if they wanted areas that they typically struggle to fund. And we have also said, if you would like to share videos or photos, please do, but there's no obligation to do so. And other than that, we were hands off at that first stage. And what we then do is shortlist, actually half of them this year. And that second stage is then a little bit more in depth, but it's a video call. So it's not a written element. It's an opportunity for us to really get to know them, for passion to come through, enthusiasm. We always find out so much more from having a call. I know that's not possible for everybody. To give you a guide, we welcomed 30 applications this year, and we have shortlisted 15 of them. So that's still quite a time commitment to have 15 calls, but I really think it's worthwhile. Apologies, my clicky clock's going off. And the idea behind that was we minimize that first stage, the administrative burden, but then we have a more in-depth, personable approach to this second stage by having the call. I just wanted to touch also on Jamal's point about feedback and learning. Something we're still working on is how we give feedback. So for those who don't make our shortlist, we try to make a conscious effort to give personal feedback to everybody. And that's really hard sometimes, because it might just be that you have 2 organisations who are doing very similar work, and one is just a better fit. But it doesn't mean there was anything wrong with the application from the other one. But what I'm trying to do in feedback is to make it personal, to say what we really found impressive, and sort of just try and be a bit constructive with that. Is there anything else I wanted to share with you? Just why we think it's important, really. I think for us, having open and trusting and supportive relationship with our partners and making sure it feels like a true partnership is underpinning everything we do. So readdressing that power dynamic is really important to us, and making sure our charity partners feel they can have an open dialogue with us. and feedback, especially when things don't go to plan. So if it's all been more open and trusting from the outset, then I believe they will be more comfortable doing that in the long term. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was great to hear a bit more in depth about actually what kind of giving feedback looks like. If everybody on our panel would like to turn your videos back on and unmute yourselves, that would be great. We've got some questions that have come in from participants. Laura, we're going to come to you towards the end to kind of have some final reflections, but I'm going to bring you in here because I think you'll have some thoughts on some of the questions that have come through. So we've got a few. I think the first one we'll start with is kind of building further on what Katie's just shared there, really, which is about feedback and kind of really proper, meaningful feedback. So a question to Theo and Jamal first, as the two charities who are joining us. What does proper, meaningful feedback kind of look like for you? What would good feedback feel like and look like from a funder for you? I'll come to Theo first, if that's okay, and then Jamal. Theo.
Sure, thank you, Eliza. I think it's a really important question to be asking, to be honest. And it's not often that you get it, but I think what constructive feedback is it offering you an opportunity to learn and improve or refine your next application. And actually that point around transparency, I think Jamal alluded to it earlier, is if there is a weakness or maybe a risk which could be addressed within the application that was sent, then that's really helpful to know that is not being addressed, and it could be. So providing that direction is providing us opportunities to learn or to reduce the risks that may be associated with our work. I just want to say quickly as well, I think one, I think Hannah's experience from applying to applications is evident from looking at the application form on the blue thread, but also Katy, like the fact that you engage with a dynamic conversation, and I think that in itself opens an opportunity to be more personable in regards to providing that feedback to someone at the other end, and also empathizing with how it feels.
Thanks, Theo. Jamal.
Yes, feedback is very important, and you know, sometimes there is something you might not be aware of. You know, if you don't, if the funder didn't tell you, you will not be able to be aware of and address that issue in the future. For example, we have an application from the lottery fund, and they ask us a question, and then we requested a feedback, and they give us a call. And when we discussed, then they told us there are similar organizations. We funded this project, and in another organization locally, for example. So we were not aware of. So this feedback will help us to, for example, to search around us, to contact the other organization and find out what they are really doing, and try to make sure we do our homework properly, so that when it comes to the funders, we are aware of everything. So if we don't receive that type of feedback, then we're gonna miss out, and we are not be able to identify. So it is very important, I believe, to have a feedback, because it will help you to progress and address any issue or concerns in the eyes of the funder. And also you learn from that positive experience and try to improve it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jamal. I think both of you raised really good points there about not just feedback, that's constructive feedback that helps you with your next funding application, but that also is a kind of useful process of reflection to go through anyway in terms of your own work and kind of developing your programs and thinking about practice. Laura, would you like to respond at all?
Yes.
As a fellow fundraiser, I just had a couple of bits to add in that I thought might be helpful. So first thing I'd say is share something positive if you can. It can be really demoralizing just endlessly applying for grants, and that's also something that the person who's made the application can share with their trustees or their fellow colleagues, which is great. Number two, which builds on exactly what Jamal and Theo were saying, in terms of constructive feedback, think about if it's something that a charity can change or control. If they can change it or control it, it's great to share it. If there's a reason, that's outside of their control, it might not be something they can do. So have a think about whether that's actually valuable to share. And then the final thing, just putting it back on funders, which is always what I like to do. If you're finding that lots of charities are getting declined for the same reason and you're giving the same feedback time and time again, have a think about your eligibility. Is there something you're not saying about what you want or how you want to be receiving applications? Because that might help you to stop receiving applications that aren't quite meeting the mark for you.
Absolutely, Laura, thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in, which I'm going to pass to Katy and Hannah, if that's okay, but just kind of wrapping them up as one question. I think it's really about how do you, when you have a very a streamlined application form and process, and maybe a lot of it's quite relational in the way that you've talked about, how do you ensure kind of fairness and consistency when you're making those judgments, which we all know are not a science? So kind of how do you think about that at your organisations? Hannah first, if that's okay.
I think it's a good question. I think sometimes as funders we worry about that a lot, and therefore our processes become like very, very, very complicated, so that we can try and make an objective decision as possible. And the maximal example of this is what a government tender looks like, because government really does try to be really like equal about how they've considered stuff. And so for me, there's X 100,000 charities in the UK, even just within, I don't know, domestic abuse, there'll be 10,000, and we can only fund, let's say, 100 of them this year. There's no way that we can make a truly fair process. And I think I would question whether there is a truly fair process. So for me, I think it's a little bit about slightly letting go of trying to create a super consistent objective process, and instead creating a process that gets your funding out there in a reasonable way to organizations that meet the objectives that you're trying to meet. And I think that might be slightly controversial, but I'm just going to put it out there.
Let's see if it blows up the chat. Thanks, Hannah. Katy.
Well, I completely echo what Hannah says. I couldn't have said it better, and very much speak from experience, having tied myself up in all sorts of emotional knots, trying to be so fair and sort of almost losing sleep over it, actually, because you feel such a responsibility, because we know what's at stake for all of these charity partners and we so desperately want to help all of them. So trying to make it as fair as possible is a really key part of it. But through experience, we've learned the same thing, that actually you end up overcomplicating the process trying to achieve that. So I would say probably the stage we're at now of having this more streamlined first stage, and then a different sort of approach, media, having the conversation is perhaps fair in some ways. Some people are better at written applications, some are better at speaking in person. Their enthusiasm comes across more in that sense. So I think that helps. And having different people involved. So I'm the first point of contact, but then we have our trustees or some of my colleagues from our company come on the calls, that other people are involved. I think that always helps bring a fresh set of eyes to things. But yeah, I don't think there's one perfect fit, unfortunately.
Thank you, Katy. Absolutely. We've got another question, which is, this speaks more probably to principle 5 in the report, which is about paying attention to how the process feels. And I guess the question for the funders is, how do you do that? How do you kind of know how it feels to the applicants? What ways do you put yourself in their shoes, so to speak? So maybe I might come to you, Hannah, just to give a bit of an insight into that. And then maybe Jamal, if you had thoughts on actually what you'd like funders to ask you about the funding experience, or ways that you'd like funders to ask what it feels like to apply for funding. we'll come to you after if that's okay. So Hannah first.
Thanks, Eliza. So our very short application kind of expression of interest form, it's not even really an application form, has a question at the bottom which says, how did it feel for you to do this? It's really short anyway, and the most common response if people answer that question is, it was very short, thanks very much. And the other thing we do is kind of once a year or so, we've been sending out feedback surveys, which people can do anonymously or not, it's up to them. I try and really limit myself to like 4 or 5 meaningful questions. They are multiple choice with an optional comment box. And they say things like, we're trying to make an easy process, how does it feel? Or we're trying to use phone calls rather than application forms. Is that okay with you? What would you rather do? And the other thing we try and do is when we get feedback from that, I try and go back to the wider group and say, this is what we've done as a result of the feedback people have told us. Because I think it's really important if you're going to ask people for input to tell them where it's gone and what's happened as a result.
Thanks, Hannah. Jamal.
Yes, I think from my experience, it's good to have a telephone call conversation with the offender, at least, and because it helps to understand more and also to get a proper feedback. And when offenders, they are assessing the offending application, and to make that part a conversation or a telephone call or online meeting with the applicant, it's a really good thing to do, because I think when you speak with them and they understand you, if they have any issues with your application and you clarify, that will make it, you know, better, make your position better. So, and it helps, and we have experienced this in 2 applications when we had such a call, and we have been awarded. And the other thing is because most of the smaller organizations, they don't have that expertise, you know, they don't have that competence to prepare a proper application and look, you know, like most of the organizations, they pay professional fees, some people to do for them. But if you are not able to, sorry, man. Yeah, my dad, he's got dementia, and I am with him, so that's why he called me, and I'm trying to answer him as well.
No worries.
And so what happened is, this is a smaller organization, they don't have that much experience. And having this call from the offender will give them some experience as well, and try to understand more how the decisions are made, how the process works. So I think if the offenders do that, there will be a big step towards achieving better outcome. And I believe sometimes is very hard, but I think we need to do some changes. And I believe that is one of the areas that it will help as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jamal. Thank you. Keeva, is there anything from the research in terms of kind of the overall feedback from charities on how they'd like to be involved, or the work that we're doing on open trusting?
Yeah, it was really interesting when we first started this work, so in May last year. One of the things that charities fed back is that when we're applying for stuff, it feels like we're just speaking to someone behind a screen who doesn't understand what we actually have to go through. And that was like one of the biggest takeaways from that piece of work. When we were talking to funders, a lot of funders from this report actually used to be fundraisers themselves. They had kind of gone through that experience. They kind of knew what it felt like in that sense. There was loads of people talking about the importance of staying connected to the sector in terms of still volunteering and that kind of thing, speaking to friends who are fundraisers, staying connected in that sense. But I think it is a good reminder for all of us, even at IVAR, to always kind of go back to charities and say, okay, actually, how is this process for you? We're actually doing a piece of work at the moment around, so as part of the open trusting work, we're looking at how to hold funders who have signed up accountable to the commitments they've signed up to, and how to kind of create a reflective space in that sense. But the first thing we need to do is go to charities and say, well, actually, what is being an open and trusting funder like for you? Like what behaviours does that include for you? So I think it's just always really important to go back to charities and actually ask them, what is it that it looks like to you, and start from there, and let that be your the first thing that you do, and let it inform everything else.
Absolutely. Thank you, Keeva. Some really good points coming in on the Q&A as well, about just the importance, which I think echoes what both charities and funders have said today, of transparency as much as possible, just being really clear about what you can and can't fund, and or making space in your process for people to have a quick chat about that. And also just sometimes the terrifying nature of having a funding call. I think one of our charities that we spoke to for this study described it as akin to being a teenager and picking up the phone to someone you wanted to ask out on a date for the first time, and just, I guess, remembering the emotion that comes with all of that. So anything you can provide in advance for charities so that they know what questions you might be asking, even if it's an informal call, those things feel very daunting when you're really want to get some money to be able to do something important in your community. I think we've got time for one more question before I ask Laura to give some reflections on what you've heard and the work with Fixiform. One of the questions that came in has come in, I think it's coming through a direct message, but is about picking up on what was said earlier in the talks about the small charities particularly, and access. So just, I guess, thoughts on the panel about ways in which funders can think about supporting small charities to apply for funding, particularly thinking about how to make funding processes more accessible for individuals or organisations or groups who are perhaps more underrepresented, or the funding process just actually disadvantages them in some way. Particularly, Theo mentioned against huge charities with whole fundraising teams, and actually kind of how you might adapt your funding practices to allow them to be more accessible. And I think, Jamal, you also mentioned organisations that have started up during the last kind of two years in response to COVID, actually new organisations with less of a track record. How do you can you change application and assessment processes to make them more open and trusting in terms of supporting those kinds of groups too? Katy, any thoughts on that you'd like to chip in on?
I'm still processing it all, to be honest. I suppose it's partly coming back to the point I made at the beginning about us as funders to keep adapting and evolving as well, and not be stagnant. So keep looking at what we're doing and thinking, how can we do it better? But in terms of smaller organisations, I suppose it's expectations as well. So being cognizant that every organisation is going to respond in a slightly different way, and that's fine and that's good. So not trying to compare like for like, but reviewing everyone in for its own merit, if you like. I'm not so sure perhaps about the accessibility side. I suppose just our way of streamlining the process as far as possible so that it can be interpreted in many different ways, perhaps, as long as we feel we're getting the right information, but it can be conveyed however suits them best. Is probably the best thing. And I think a point that perhaps Laura might bring up is this idea of making it proportional. So sort of, don't over ask, really stop and think, how much are we offering here? How much do we really need to know? How much can we find ourselves in the public domain? And just strip it back and not put unnecessary demands, especially on smaller, newer charities, because they're just going to spend all their time working on grant applications rather than implementing the work you want to support.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katy. I think that's absolutely the key thing, isn't it? Is to allow charities to invest the limited resources in doing the work that's needed rather than servicing applications necessarily. I'm going to say that was a brilliant segue into Laura's reflection. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to say thank you to our panelists for your responses and engagement with those questions. You may now turn your screens off and keep yourselves on mute. And I'll hand over to Laura to maybe introduce Fixiform a little bit to the audience and share what it's kind of this conversation's brought up for you today.
Thank you very much. So lovely to be here with you this afternoon. Just to introduce myself, I'm coming from a sort of both sides perspective. So I'm a fundraiser working for a charity by day, but I've formerly been a trustee, and I'm also co-founder of Fixiform, which I'll talk about. It's fantastic to see a conversation focused on funder application forms and processes. This is something, as you can imagine, that frequently occupies the headspace of people applying for funds. But often those conversations aren't reflected in the funder community in quite the same way. The broad principles highlighted throughout the report are really refreshing to see. The ones that particularly resonated were number 1, don't waste time, and number 4, ask relevant questions. So I'll talk a bit more about those, but I'll also touch briefly on 4 and 5, which is about the applicant experience and feedback, which I hope will be helpful. Just for a bit of context about Fixiform. So Fixiform is a grassroots, international, volunteer-led movement that focuses on quick, practical fixes to save charities vital time and funds. So hopefully very relevant for the conversation that we've been having. 500 grant seekers from 9 different countries back in December 2020 told us what they wanted to see change with application forms and processes, and they didn't hold back. There was a lot of strength of feeling, and particularly it was the smaller organisations without professional fundraisers that really told us that they felt blocked out of funding when there were poor practices. To date, Fixiform has saved 1 million hours worth of charity time thanks to the changes that have been put in place by grants management providers and funders. So that's brilliant as a starting point for us. But we're now going back to grant seekers to find out how to focus our time and energy. And this has been really helpful, hearing some of the questions that are being asked, some of the reflections so far. In terms of what we're finding, very, very early findings, just to give you a sneak peek from what we're hearing. The top 3 fixes are still the priority for our grant seekers. So I'll touch upon those in a minute if you're thinking, where do I start with all of this? And they align really well with the report. There's very little appetite for a common application form. So if that's how you're spending your time and energy and having lots of conversations there, it's not so interesting to grant seekers. There is very much a sense of one size doesn't have to fit all. And finally, it's a really mixed bag with how charities are feeling at the moment. Some have seen some really positive changes and are really pleased about that, but others feel that there are just these pervasive bad practices that they really want to see change. There's more, but watch this space. We'll release full findings once we have them. So coming back to the brilliant IVAR report, number 1, don't waste time. So it's the first principle, and it's probably the most important and relevant for Fixiform. So we asked the grant seekers to sort of quantify the opportunity cost. We found that around 20% of time was wasted on badly designed application forms and processes. So there's a lot of time that is being wasted, unfortunately. Our top 3 fixes, as chosen by the grant seeker community, all relate either directly or indirectly to this kind of question of time saving. I'm going to pop a quick link in the chat so you can look at the full findings and go into a bit more depth in those in your own time. But number 1, have a form that you can save and return to. So if your internet crashes or if you just lose the page for some reason, it's heartbreaking to lose all of that hard work and to have to redo it again. So that is commonly the biggest pain point when a form isn't savable. Number 2, a little bit more subjective here, but time taken is disproportionate to the funding on offer. So if you think about if your form is taking half a day to complete and it's for £5,000, is that really worth it for the person filling that out? If you don't know how long it takes to fill out your form, that's something you should be looking at. And then the third one is being able to see all the questions in advance. So that's really important so that the person filling out the form or going through the process can have all the information to hand. It's not so stop-start. They can make an informed decision about whether they want to apply to you. And the hated forms are the ones where you have to fill in all the fields before you can click next, because you just can't see what you're going to be asked next and you have to do it all in one go. So see if you fall into any of those traps, because they're 3 things that can really waste time. In terms of number 4, asking relevant questions, this answer really stayed with me from when we got the original survey responses. If you're giving charities 20 questions to answer about governance, but only giving them 100 words to talk about the impact of the funded project, what does it say about what you care about? So have a think about what your question's actually asking and what message it's conveying about what you want to see from the people applying. Having to manually enter it in things like trustee names or income and expenditure can waste time. So if you can accept a link to a charity commission page with a bit of room for narrative, if someone wants to explain something, that can be really helpful and time saving. And there was a great question about actually, well, how do we understand what it feels like from a charity perspective, and what can we do? In terms of feedback, I think this has been touched upon in the session so far, but it's incredibly challenging for charities to give genuine feedback. And you're more likely to get helpful and honest feedback if A, it's anonymous, B, if it's from a charity that doesn't hope to get funds from you now or in the future, or C, if it's from one of your funded partners that feels really secure in the relationship and feels that you've built up a great rapport and that they're in a position where they can be honest with you. So think about who you're asking for feedback from and how you're asking in order to get the real feedback. One useful exercise you could do is identify a charity that would be eligible for funding and actually have a go filling out your form yourself, because you'll see where all those sticking points are. So if you're thinking about, rather than just asking charities, how do you experience this, actually have a go, time it, see how long it takes, see where, is it easy, is it hard? So just some final thoughts from a Fixiform perspective. Done is better than perfect. So the last thing we want is for everyone to stop giving grants while they try and work out the perfect application form, because it doesn't really exist, but also it's okay to be making those incremental changes. But the question I'd like to leave you all with is to really think about how you turn these brilliant principles into practical action. So what are you going to do differently by this time next week, and how will your application form or process look different? So if you'd like to get in touch, please email fixiform@gmail.com, or you can follow the hashtag on Twitter. Thanks to IVAR again for promoting this really important topic, for inviting Fixiform to share a few perspectives, and it's been really brilliant listening to and learning from everyone today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Laura, and a kind of lovely note to end this webinar on, really. 1 million hours of charity time saved in their applications for funding, which is astounding. And I think today we've had lots of ideas and discussions on some of the tricky stuff, as well as some of the quick wins, like a savable form, showing the questions in advance, and some of the things that are going to need exploring further in general, the kind of perennial challenges around risk, around access, around feedback and other things. So the Open and Trusting Community is an initiative of over 100 funders, and we're working on some of these challenges together. So if you're interested in joining that, if you're not part of it already, we'll post the link in the chat. You get to join a community of 100 funders. We have community of practice meetings to really kind of get to the nitty gritty of some of these practice and cultural and strategy challenges together. There's some unanswered questions we haven't had time for, but we'll try and respond to those in a follow-up email. So all that is left is for me to say thank you to all of our speakers and contributors, to Theo, to Jamal, to Katy, to Hannah, to Laura and Keeva, and also thank you to all of the funders and charities that took part in the research. And have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's been great to have you here.